Welcome back to Living in Mexico. I'm Ana Maria Salazar. Thank you so much for joining us. Donald Trump has been in office for 1 year, and boy, the world has changed since then. Well, one of the countries that has most been affected by Donald Trump has been Mexico. And Mexico has had to change. The Mexican government has to change many things, including their security policies, their trade policies, and how they negotiate with a new relationship with the United States. To talk about this, joining us today is Ivan Zapien. You know him well. He's been joining us throughout the years. He's a partner in Washington, D.C. at Hogan Lowe's. Gosh, I don't even know where to start, Ivan. Welcome to the show. Why don't you just run down what you see as the impact Donald Trump's had on, let's talk about the Mexican government. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Anna Maria. It's great to be with you. I mean, I think the best place to always start with Donald Trump is to remember that Donald Trump is a once in a lifetime, once hopefully in history phenomenon that no one ever saw coming. No one understands where it's going. So in many ways, it's sort of like one of these freak storms, right? That people didn't see coming and don't know where it's going. So since 2015, when Donald Trump came down the stairs, and as a former Democrat, took on the Republican establishment, some of the best candidates the Republican establishment had, beat them all, right? Took over the Republican Party, lost to Joe Biden, 4 years later, came back, beat 14, cases against him, got convicted of other cases. And here we are, a year into his second administration, and he has come back full force, Ana Maria. He has come back and established norms in Washington, D.C., around the world in terms of how diplomatic channels work, how relations between countries work, in terms of what executive powers mean, what the guardrails are for executive powers, what the role of Congress is, what the role of the courts are. So across the board, I think that we're seeing a seismic shift. I think politically, Donald Trump is a phenomenon. I think one of the things that I always caution people is that I don't necessarily think Donald Trump and Republicans are one and the same. I think it's actually two different phenomenons. I think we're about to see that in the midterms where Donald Trump is not actually on the ballot. Since Donald Trump first ran in 2015, we've seen this phenomenon where Republicans don't do as well as Donald Trump does, and I think we're going to see that in the midterms. But that leaves that leaves a country that is in a position moving forward in thinking about what happens after Donald Trump and how you put back the institutions, how you go back the norms, or whether those norms and institutions happen. Right. It is possible to start to contemplate of like okay, so what happens if has it occurred to anybody that maybe the next president uses the same powers, uses the same interpretations, but is a Democrat, uses all those powers for progressive ideas, you and I have been in politics for a long time, and I've never met a politician that, gets into powers and says, you know what, I'm going to roll everything back. I'm going to give back some of these powers back to where they belong to, because that's the right thing to do. Maybe we'll find that person.
Right.
Maybe we'll find that person, but it is possible that, after Trump, we just have a different version of that.
I get a sense, and I may be wrong, that Trump understands that Mexico is different, or the United States relationship with Mexico is different than its relationship with other countries, and that I'm just trying to understand where the White House strategy is going with Mexico. I mean, that very well they started out with threatening tariffs if Mexico didn't control the border and didn't reduce the amount of fentanyl that was trafficked into the United States. Mexico has done that basically, right? And now the threat continues to even have after the Nicolás Maduro capture in Venezuela, the threat continues of on Mexico to use potentially military forces in Mexico to intercept to do land interceptions, whatever that means. So, and he continues. I mean, the threats of tariffs have not continued yet, but we are supposed to. There's supposed to be a review of the USMCA this year. Um, so I'm just trying to understand where what alliance, what allies does Mexico have, or how what what how well can um, President Claudia Sheinbaum negotiate in this environment where Donald Trump seems unstoppable. At the same time, we just don't really know what he wants with Mexico.
Yeah, Anna Marie, I think that's the right interpretation. He does seem invincible or unstoppable. He also seems the administration, seems to constantly change their motives for what they're looking at. There are people that say that that is part of a strategy, right? Which is, he's the art of the deal. This is the benign sort of version, right? Which is that he's a deal maker. So he wants to keep you on your toes so you don't know which way he's coming. And therefore, he can sort of secure a better deal. We have, yeah, in my view, that's a possibility, but it's also extremely disruptive to the world order and the world economies and any number of different things, right? So I don't think it's a healthy sort of approach to diplomacy. The good news for Mexico, is that they, along with every other country except for a handful of countries in the world, are in the same boat, right? The other good news for Mexico is that for some strange reason, we are now in a position where it's actually the Canadians that are like the feisty ones and are fighting with the Americans and not the Mexicans, right? Right. Like, so it's sort of like the world is really upside down now, right? Because we saw Prime Minister Carney in Davos sort of like just laying it thick on Donald Trump. I never think we were talking about Canadian troops coming back to Washington D.C. and burning the White House. It really is Looney Tunes.
Right.
It's Looney Tunes. But in the case of Mexico, I think it's hard to articulate, from sort of a geopolitical perspective, what they want from Mexico, other than for the Chinese not to have a big role in Mexico and stop sending fentanyl.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that seems pretty clear, right? That's something that they want to make sure. They want to get the Chinese out of Mexico. They want the Chinese influence out of Mexico, Chinese products out of Mexico, and they want the fentanyl thing to stop. That came from his campaign. But after that, and I don't know what that decision tree looks like, right? But I don't think that's 50 asks, right? I think that's like 10 asks that that could probably in short order be done. After that, I'm not quite sure what he wants at the moment or what the administration wants, right? So it's hard to see, at what point Trump just focuses in on Mexico like he's done in Iran or he has done in Venezuela, because the actual point where he says, this is my victory, which is important, right? Like it's so important to him that he needs to make an action, do something, and quickly declare victory. It's hard to see where he declares victory, but he'll figure it out at some point, right? And what can President Sheinbaum do to prepare for that? Probably nothing, right? Just hope that because I mean, like it's just unpredictable, right? It depends on the day, it depends on the news cycle, it depends on what may or may not have happened, to attract attention.
So I guess that's the problem, right? We don't know what Donald Trump would consider a win, a political win, in regards to his Mexico policy. And I guess we do have to remind our audience, Mexico, when he was campaigning, was a big part of his campaign promises, right? That have been fulfilled. He's reduced there is very little migration, undocumented people or aliens crossing from Mexico into the United States. And there seems to be indications that there's also less fentanyl crossing from Mexico into the United States. So what is a win for Donald Trump? Is it going to be the USMCA? I mean, it does raise the question, by the way, Ivan, do you think there is going to be a USMCA, or they're going to be able to evaluate or review the USMCA or renegotiate the USMCA this year?
I mean, I do think that in the end, this comes together, right? If you push me hard, to articulate, how it comes together and how that plane gets landed, like, I don't know, I don't know. So it could be partially just a hope, right? That I think
Mhm.
that it's a pattern, right? It's a pattern where the administration sort of says this is never going to happen, leverage, 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 and then at the last minute it
Mhm.
lands in a good place. I think substantively, right, not landing USMCA would just be a disaster for the automotive sector, for a
Right.
variety of sectors, that are
Mhm.
hugely important to, all three countries' economies, right? So I think they would be disastrous. But do I think that briefing paper that articulates, how much of a disaster is either read or considered, as they're
Mhm.
thinking it through? It is by the USTR, it is by, the Department of Commerce, Treasury, State Department, but I don't necessarily think that it drives the messaging towards Mexico. But the messaging towards Mexico, in my opinion, is simply, you need to be doing exactly what I ask to be done when I ask it to be done. And to that extent, I think that the Scheinbaum administration has done a good job at least keeping that channel open, whether they're doing everything or not. They've also done a good job in not publicly, fighting with Donald Trump.
Right.
Donald Trump doesn't seem to have a beef with Claudia Sheinbaum, which is a
Mhm.
win in every respect of the
Mhm.
word in this environment. Um, what does that get you? What does that get you? What is the New York Times saying you have a good relationship? Well, it gets you that people say that you're doing a decent job, right? But again, it's so unpredictable, right? That there's just not really, the randomness of what
Mhm.
is happening. And maybe it's, I'm not privy to their strategy, but from an
Mhm.
outside perspective, it just seems like their focus internationally is randomly. And if you're Mexico, if you're Colombia, if you're Ecuador, if you're Sweden, if you're Denmark, like, I'm not
Mhm.
sure how you prepare for that.
Now, but so it sounds like what you're saying is that it's the Sheinbaum's strategy, or President Sheinbaum's strategy right now, is basically have she wakes up in the morning, her teams wakes up in the morning, just see what's on Truth Social, on social media, whatever statements the president may have made the evening 24 hours before, and she just they have to basically come out and just react to whatever is coming out that day, right? It's hard to anticipate or kind of plan out any strategy, especially in
Yeah, no,
regards
no.
to the USMCA.
No, that I mean that, but that's exactly that. That's absolutely correct. But I will say, right, that, like, it's True Social now, but remember, like, if we go back to the other administration, it was Twitter.
Twitter,
Right. Like, I remember
right.
when Trump finally left, the conversation in Washington, D.C. was like, finally, those of us that have to follow politics or have to do this, like, we
Hmm.
may be able to finish a dinner one night without getting an alert that, like, something
Right,
that affects us was tweeted
right,
out. Right.
right.
Because there's no real cadence, right, in
Hmm.
methodology to when it goes out. So I think in Mexico's case, I think that's true. I think that's one.
Hmm.
But the other thing that I think Mexico has done very well, and other countries have done it very well, is that they just sort of put all of that aside, Right, put all of that aside and you send the
Right.
people to the meetings to negotiate,
Hmm.
right, and to sit down and have a conversation, right, and sort of just ignore, right,
Hmm.
ignore the analysis that this is never going to happen, the
Hmm.
testimony, from government officials saying the president doesn't want this, the direct messages from the president. You ignore that and you just sort of keep moving forward. This is the era we live in. That's probably as good as you can get.
So, does Donald Trump care what's going to happen during the midterm election? It sounds like, I mean, the way he's making decisions, it seems like he doesn't care. I mean, he makes announcements. I mean, just watching how his migration policy and, the cruelty behind it, these images of, arresting a young boy in order to go grab his father. I mean, the cruelty behind the migration policy seems to that people would be, especially Mexican Americans or Hispanic vote, would disappear, or at least they would not be voting for Republicans or whomever supports Donald Trump. I mean, you know, the U.S. is not more affordable as far as I can see. People are continue to suffer with inflation or the cost of living in general. So, I mean, what do you think is going to happen in the midterm election? And how should we be following this from Mexico?
You know, So that's a complex question that I'm not sure anybody's qualified to answer, whether he cares about it or not. I think there's definitely people within the Trump administration political apparatus that understand the consequences of losing, particularly the House of Representatives, right? Because
Mhm.
because I think or if you look at the big picture of the way in which you need to be thinking about a presidency, like the House of Representatives changing hands may not change much of Donald Trump's, sort of governing philosophy, right? But
Mhm.
like, I'm not sure he's going to love the idea of being impeached for the third time, right? Which is
Mhm.
probably likely to happen. He won't get
Mhm.
convicted in the Senate, right? Like he
Mhm.
won't get convicted in the Senate, but like, there are
Mhm.
people I imagine in the Trump world, including Donald Trump, right?
Mhm.
That want to make sure that they maintain the House of Representatives.
Right.
And what they do, right, ranging from, improving, their numbers with segments of the population, making quick turns right before the election, in the economy, all those things that are on the table. I
Mhm.
assume that they're going to try, but right now, where I sit here, like it doesn't look like they're really focused, but maybe I don't subscribe to the right channel that they're
Mhm.
sending messages on. But when in an environment where affordability is the biggest issue,
Right.
right?
Mhm.
Like talking about taking over Greenland for 3 days, doesn't have anything to do with your grocery prices. Doesn't have
Right.
anything to do with the fact that the average age for first time homeowners in the U.S. for the first time is 49, right?
Mhm.
Those are the things that I think, not the whole segment, but like there's a segment of the population that
Mhm.
you always think about elections not as the American people, right, but as the
Right.
7 to 9% of the people in the American
Right.
electorate that actually decide. True swing voters that go one way or the other, or people that have never voted that come out because they're angry
Mhm.
and they want to make a statement, right? So it's a pretty narrow segment. So the
Mhm.
question was, what is going on in their minds, right? And if affordability is the big issue, I just don't understand how taking over Greenland,
It's going to help.
is going to help that
Mhm.
particular issue.
Yeah.
But maybe I don't understand.
What should we be following this year? I mean, what issues or what decisions are you following very closely?
Yeah, so the Supreme Court has some big decisions coming down that I think will impact long term and short term for this administration. One, the voting rights issue, which may
Right.
actually redraw some districts in a way that would be a benefit to the
Mm-hmm.
Republicans in the midterm. The tariffs, the tariffs case in the Supreme Court, could just do a doozy, both on the economy as well as, as well as the import export sort of world. And then the third issue is they're going to have to decide whether the president can fire, the Fed the Fed governor that they fired, and whether or not the Fed is independent. So I think those three issues I think are really important issues. And then the fourth thing to watch really is, where Donald Trump is on affordability in terms of approval or not, right? Though I think the Supreme Court cases will actually like really mark the future powers that he has, and then the political issues will mark, where he is politically and likely to be. And we have to start contemplating what the world looks like after Trump.
Well, as usual, it's always great to have you on the show. It sounds like 2026 is going to be, I don't know if crazier than 2025, but it potentially could be crazier. I mean, I can't imagine it being crazier, but it
Yeah,
sounds
I
like
never.
it's
Yeah,
gonna,
I think we're using old terms. We're using old
right,
prisms, right?
right,
Like this is the new normal, right? Like like we've gone through the looking glass. We're on the other side,
right.
right? I don't think we're gonna come back,
Okay,
right? Like and like in the Matrix movie when they take the
right,
pill, the red one or the
right.
green one, we've taken the pill, and this is it, right? This is like now normal.
This is now normal. Ivan Sapien is a partner from Washington, D.C. He's a partner at Hogan Lovells. Thank you so much for joining us here on Living in Mexico.